Good evening. Welcome to the launch panel event for Marc Edge's newish book. Now came out in late April, The Postmedia Effect. My name is Robert Hackett. I'm the publisher of Marc's book and publisher of New Star Books. I'd like to welcome everybody in molecular and virtual form to this event, which we'll be broadcasting tonight from Musqueam, Slale, Lowtooth, Squamish territories, temporarily known as British Columbia. I have tonight's we're going to have a panel featuring Marc Edge, Bob Hackett, and Charlie Smith, whose chair I'm in because it was 3 seats setting up, and I'm doing an introduction, and then I will step away. So thanks all of you for coming out, and thanks all of you on the World Wide Web for joining us this evening. I have been publishing Marc's work since 2001, practically all of his books, but I've actually known Marc for a lot longer than that, since the late 1970s. And I've developed a keen sense of Marc's, what Marc brings to the party. Back in the late 70s, I was on the UBC student newspaper, Marc was on the Peak. And we were kind of young student journalists. We were kind of frenemies, I think, the Peak and we would call us nowadays. And Marc, he occupied an interesting position. All of us who mostly came from, Kerrisdale and Shaughnessy and Oak Bay and Tony, places like that, were of course, generation 1968 revolutionary cadres. And there was a certain amount of superciliousness that Marc had to put up with because he was seen as being out here a little bit in right field because he was studying commerce out at SFU. So even though he was perhaps the one person in our group that had, real working class, bona fide working class credentials, he was the guy that everybody considered, a little bit right-wing and maybe politically, blah, blah, blah. And a certain amount of time went by, decades. Everybody who had been in this knot of people continued more or less as they were. Marc continued more or less as he was. But after the passage of a certain amount of time, Marc was actually way out to the left of this group. And when we were back in university, if you had predicted that Marc Edge would be the person who would be 40, 50 years later contributing to Canadian Dimension and communistic publications like that, we would have guffawed. Yet Marc is the one who has kind of stayed the course, stayed true to the beliefs and the principles that he held in the late 70s. And I have a couple of theories about that. The thing that the reason we suspected Marc's politics was back in the 70s, he was not an ideologue. We all kind of wore our ideologies on our sleeves, whereas Marc, we all have ideologies, but Marc was a lot more of a skeptic and a doubting Thomas, and he wanted to see the proof. The other thing that I think shed some light on what happened is back in the late 70s, we were all part of this generation of young journalists who were inspired by All the President's Men and the Watergate story. And I think, when did that movie come out? 60s, 70s, 76. And of course, the big meme, we'll call it nowadays, from that film was Follow the Money. And we all loved that idea because, to us young revolutionaries, it kind of, it distilled our Marxo-historical materialism in a nice way. And, but for Marc, it was his chief method, the chief method of his work for the next many decades, not generations yet, many decades. And the work that we're discussing today, as well as Marc's other work, really is the result of following the money, but also reading and thinking about what a lot of other people have had to say about these self-same events. This practice is praxis, I guess you could say, is central to Marc's work as a journalist and a writer. And if one of, I think, the animating central beliefs that Marc has is that a well-informed citizenry is crucial to the functioning of a democratic society. The trouble is the Murdochs and the Postmedias of the world look at the same facts and say, exactly, and do everything they can to make sure that we don't have that picture. As a footnote, it is kind of sobering, and it was sobering to me to find out that Watergate was not, as we all thought at the time, a triumph of investigative journalism, although there was a lot of really great investigative journalism going on. But it was also the result of a carefully orchestrated leak job from the FBI itself. And that's worth keeping in mind as kind of a background radiation of the politics that we're witnessing in the United States right now. It's not an obvious thing that the FBI can be trusted to everybody. The panelists that we have tonight, I'm really happy to, in a second, give up my seat here for Charlie Smith, who has been for decades doing his level best at the Georgia Strait to fill the gap in local news that has been a growing gap since the 1980s for reasons that Marc has been documenting in his books. I think of his work as a political economy of the news, and I think he sometimes resists that a little bit, but I think his work is critical to understanding why the news media has taken the shape it has taken in Canada and also in other jurisdictions in the world, because money flows. Our other panelist, Bob Hackett, has also been confronting the effect of this, the work that Marc has been describing for decades, in terms of what, there's two ways you can lie. You can lie directly, but you can also lie by admission, and those are often the most useful lies because they create a different frame of events and a frame for the conversation. And Bob has worked very hard in his career, he's now retired, in drawing attention to this and bringing some attention to some of the news stories that we don't get to read about because, well, we just, they're not really news. And in fact, the Postmedia Effect is actually talking a lot about how the very things that it's writing about, that this book is about, which are so critical to our functioning as a democracy, are news. On that note, I will give my chair over to Charlie and turn the floor over to, I'm not sure whether Bob or Charlie wants to go first, but both of you, I think, have prepared some comments, and I will let you guys jump in and take it away from here. Thank you.
And we're going back to Mary, aren't we?
I don't know what we're done today, that would be.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marc and Rolf and Charlie. I've known Marc about 22 years, but we've been associates at SFU. Sometimes Marc taught my course on newspaper policy when we still had a course on newspaper policy. And so I'm maybe a little bit biased, but I really do like this book. I think there's a number of things about it that I find appealing. The usual engaging writing that Marc does, but also meticulous research that draws upon his years of experience in reporting on business. It's storytelling, but with a normative purpose, as Rolf noted, a commitment to democratic journalism. It's an informative overview that helps us make sense of recent events. It recognizes the continued importance of newspapers and of a political economy of newspapers, which is something you don't find very often in my field in recent decades, really, in communication studies and media and cultural studies. So he brings something that I think needs to be strengthened in academic research as well as in political activity. And of course, I very much enjoyed Marc's trenchant critique of Postmedia. So I want to start out by saying, well, what is the Postmedia Effect? That's the title of the book. On page 52, Marc describes it as the hollowing out of Canada's largest and most influential newspapers and weaponizing that influence to continue feeding off the dying remains of Canadian news media. But I want to know what you really think. So what do you see as the most egregious violations of sound democratic journalism the blurring of advocacy and reporting, advertorials for sale to the highest bidder, the return of the partisan press, centralized control over editorials, resource rationalization within the post-media chain and consequent lack of local reporting, the failure to state conflicts of interest, the abuse of power to campaign for government handouts, and the greedy acceptance of such handouts. So maybe one could say, well, it's maybe all of the above.
All of the above.
But I think it's even more than that, as chapter 5 in particular, which is the one I most enjoyed. It's also moving the Overton window of acceptable debate, options for policy debate, significantly to the right in Canada, laundering extremist views, providing a platform and perhaps sanitizing them for broader audiences, and confusing large numbers of Canadians about the causes and consequences of what now is arguably the biggest issue and challenge that humanity faces, which is, of course, global heating. So it's very significant then, as he outlines in chapter 5, Postmedia has an especially cozy relationship with big oil. And I was glad to see you drew on a study that I did for a co-authored study in Monitor magazine, and it's in the bibliography sandwiched between Jürgen Habermas and Adolf Hitler. So it's easy to find. One small part of the reason that of that cozy relationship between Postmedia and big oil is possibly revenues from sponsored content or advertorials, news that, or not really news, but advertisements that are made to look like news, because Postmedia welcomes the revenue, and big oil at that time, at least when it was engaged in that sort of advertorial campaign in the mid 2010s, needed legitimacy, is facing sort of public relations problem. But also, I think perhaps more important are the conservative politics and or political ambitions of some of the Postmedia board members. Maybe even more important might be a market decision to capture the conservative audience segment in Canadian newspaper readership, and employing extreme columnists as rage bait, as one commentator put it, rage bait to provoke online readers to hate play on articles. So what are the implications of Marc's critical analysis of Postmedia for media policy and politics in Canada? Would more vigorous enforcement of antitrust or competition law make much difference to the political functioning of Canada's press? Or do we need more radical measures? Well, rather than get into the specifics of particular policies, I would just like to outline some possible principles or criteria, sort of benchmarks, touchstones for democratic press. So think about it yourself. What would you expect from the press in democracy? 25 years ago, my colleague Yutzi Zhao and I wrote a book on the politics of objectivity in North American journalism, and we were skeptical of how objectivity is defined in North American journalism. But we operated with, I guess, 5 or 6 principles that we thought that media could be evaluated by. That included participation, equality, representative diversity, civic efficacy, that is the feeling that we can actually engage in political action and make changes, and genuine choice. So those are sort of principles that we used, this is 25 years ago, to evaluate how well Canada's press is or is not doing. But since then, there's been, I think, a more useful summary. I'm going to sort of override your advice not to get into this one, but I think it can be explained quite briefly as 4 roles for journalism in a democratic society. It's from Clifford Christians and his colleagues in a 2009 book called, I think it was called Normative Theories of the Press in a Democratic Society. The first is the monitorial role, okay? The press should be reporting on issues, should be a watchdog in power. It should inform us of policies, actions, and events that affect us, and scan these for threats to our well-being, individually and collectively. So that's monitoring the scene, okay, and acting as a watchdog on power. The second is the facilitative role, that is stimulating a robust public sphere and public conversation, clarifying arguments, making hidden interests transparent, and giving fair access to contending perspectives, regardless of whether they are powerful and rich or not. A third one is the radical role, which is less commonly, I suppose, appreciated, but it means actively advocating and mobilizing, perhaps campaigning for fundamental change against hegemonic institutions, whether that be the entire capitalist system or particular modes of governments or governance or whatever. And that's a role usually associated with so-called alternative media. And finally, perhaps the least known or recognized is the collaborative role that is supporting other institutions when they engage in productive campaigns or policies. And it need not even be political. You can think of sports journalists, right? They tend to report favorably on the local team. So that's a kind of collaboration between the press and a particular institution. Often, I've written a book on this too, right? The NHL, I believe.
Mm-hmm. The business side of the NHL,
as a say in sports journalism, but that I think is an example of what we might regard as a collaborative role. In the context of the now obvious climate crisis, those kinds of roles I think are even more important. So an environmental communications scholar, Robert Cox, has suggested that we should see climate communication as a crisis discipline. And I think you could apply much of what he says about climate communication to the press at large. He suggests that we should enhance the ability of society to respond appropriately to environmental signals for the benefit of environmental and human health. We should make relevant information and decision-making processes transparent and accessible to publics, and make sure that people affected by environmental threats should be able to participate in decisions affecting them. So I hear there a sort of a shadow, an echo of the notion of climate justice. And finally, communication should critically evaluate and expose environmentally harmful communication practices. Well, the question is, can market-driven commercial media fulfill those roles? How easily can they do it? Or is there a disconnect between the economic marketplace and the marketplace of ideas? Is Canadian journalism a case of market failure? And if so, why? Well, the logic, at first, just think about it, the logic of democracy is one person, one vote. What's the logic of the market? It's $1, one vote. And there's a British fellow in the 19th century who early in his illustrious and globally effective career said that the first freedom of the press is not to be a business. Can anybody guess what I'm talking about? Any idea?
initials MNC.
No. I'm talking about the 19th century. This was Karl Marx early in his career as an editor, newspaper journalist himself. But here's another quote for you. Is this another communist coming up? Okay, but listen carefully. Freedom of the press is not a property right of owners. It is a right of the people. It is part of the right to free expression, inseparable from their right to inform themselves. Any takers?
Tom Kent.
Yes, Tom Kent, very good. The chair of the Canadian Royal Commission on Newspapers in 1980 and 81.
And a former journalist.
I guess that's true. Yeah. He wrote, so in other words, a free press isn't a property right of owners. It's something you need in a democracy, and it's something that in effect should belong to all of us. It shouldn't be defined as simply the right of owners to do what they like with newspapers and properties. And there's one aspect of a commercialized press is it has a kind of class bias. Historically, the British media historian James Curran has argued that commercially and advertising-driven legacy media, if you like, local legacy media, acted as a form of structural censorship because there's a kind of economic bias against working class and less affluent readerships and their concerns by comparison with readers who are more valuable to advertisers. And that's why prestige newspapers can survive with much smaller circulations than millions of people, newspapers with millions of working class readers that actually went out of business due to insufficient advertising. So even Tom Kent, to go back to his report, he said that in the transition away from the 19th century partisan press, it was left-wing viewpoints that tended to be underrepresented as commercialism increased its hold. So that's one problem with the commercially driven newspaper, the legacy media system, is that it doesn't fairly represent all different ranges of opinion within the population. There's a kind of class bias to it, and arguably a sort of corporate spin on the framing of news as well. So that's one problem. Others, though, is that media are likely to undersupply the kind of journalism we need in a state of global crisis, existential threats to global civilization. Crisis journalism, for one thing, to borrow an economic term here, is a merit good. And that's a term you don't hear economists using much anymore. It doesn't really fit with the neoliberal framework of the individual consumer decides everything. But a merit good is something that people or society needs, but that people are unable or unwilling to pay for through individual purchases. Examples of that might be, fruit and vegetables or exercise. How do you get people to invest in those things? These are really good for them, but they're not likely to make the proportionate effort to get them. So people need to know about crisis situations like global heating if we are to deal with them effectively and collectively, but they may not be willing to pay for information about a threat that they don't perceive as immediate. Even though the distribution of accurate news about global heating benefits society at large. So good reporting, good journalism has what economists would call positive externalities. They have benefits to society beyond those who engage in the actual buying or selling of the particular product. So it's a merit good, but it's also, good journalism is also in large measure a public good. It doesn't mean public good is another economic phrase. It means something that's bought and sold, but whose use cannot be easily confined to those who pay for it. So, and unlike food or housing, its consumption by any one person does not reduce the ability of other people to use it. So a classic example of that is street lighting. You can't limit the use of street lamps to consumers paying on the spot to turn on a light, right? You can't provide street lighting through individual purchases, which is why historically street lighting has been financed through taxes collected from city governments. So journalism has some of the characteristics of a public good. It's partially non-excludable because even non-subscribers can gather news from free news sources or through friends, word of mouth. And it's largely non-rivalrous. That means that my access to, say, an online news site or a TV newscast does not interfere with your similar access. So even if it were possible, to some extent it is possible, to limit news to through subscription fees and online firewalls, or paywalls rather, that would not be desirable in the case of crisis journalism. We need it distributed as widely as possible, participatory and dialogic, to be both democratic and effective. So I would argue that as a merit good and a quasi-public good, then, climate crisis journalism, or indeed democratic journalism in general, is a case of market failure. It's not likely to be supplied in sufficient quantity and quality through market mechanisms. I think that has implications for policy. Should we really try to resurrect a press or a news media system that is financed through so-called private enterprise or corporate ownership, or should we look for other models? And I think that to conclude, Marc's book, even though he focuses on one corporation, it's a very productive springboard for discussing Canadian news media more broadly. That would include, if you want to look at the big picture, that would have to include the role of public broadcasting in the digital age, the production of Canadian content, and the internet. And Marc's persuaded me to hold off my rant about the internet as increasingly authoritarian and manipulative medium under corporate control, which I think very much has to be part of the analysis of how news media in Canada function. So we look forward to that in the next book, Marc.
Great. Okay, I'm Charlie Smith. I used to be editor of Georgia Strait. I knew, thank you, Bob, that Bob would see the big picture from 30,000 feet above, which is very valuable, and he would do a better job than me. So what I decided to do was be the case study for Marc's book. It isn't an exact parallel of what he has in the book, but it offers a window into what happens in vigils in the media. And I want to mention at the outset, I'm a big fan of Marc Edge's books. Greatly exaggerated the myth of the death of newspapers. It really showed me how newspaper barons exploit bankruptcy laws. He had many things in the book, but to fatten the returns to shareholders. And I thought that was a really brilliant insight, and it was very well documented. Another one of his books, The News We Deserve, it focused on the financialization of the media sector, which he also addresses in this book. But it was really shocking to me to see how these corporate public benefits packages, so when the Asper family, for instance, would buy the Southern newspapers from Conrad Black, they would offer all these benefits for society to allow this takeover. But then Marc dug through the benefits, and the real beneficiary was the corporations themselves. And again, I thought that was a very, it's a testament to his research and looking at a granular level. So his newest book, The Postmedia Effect, shows how it's full of, if you want to understand the media in Canada, but one was how small outlets were excluded from the $595 million federal bailout for newspapers. A second thing I found quite fascinating was how the company that financed Postmedia's purchase of Sun newspapers, this was a massive consolidation of corporate ownership. That same company financed North Star Capital's purchase of the Toronto Star. So you had the same debt holder working with both of them, and then lo and behold, we have North Star or Torstar and Postmedia talking about merger. Now it's on hold, but it may come back. But then Marc got into the details how Postmedia and Torstar did one of these newspaper swaps. We saw this years earlier with Black Press and Glacier, where they basically carve up regions. You can take Black Press, the eastern part of Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley, and Glacier, we're going to take the western part, and then suddenly all these newspapers close, in Richmond, in North Shore, Delta, all these places. So Marc was writing about when Postmedia and Torstar started it, 41 newspapers swapped, and then shortly thereafter, 36 publications closed. So, but here's the thing that really hit home for me with the Postmedia Effect was how the debt holders and ended up in charge of Canada's largest newspaper chain. And then they bleed it dry by sucking off the profits in payments and then throw the journalists out of work and on a large scale. So for me, I worked at the Georgia Strait for 27 years, 11 months, 3 weeks, almost 28 years. And I kind of felt a certain smugness because I used to think, I never took a paycheck from Conrad Black. I never took a paycheck from David Radler or David Thompson or Izzy Asper or the Pelodeau family. I was working for a family operation. But eventually the financialization of media caught up to me. And it began when the family that owned the Georgia Strait, and this happens to a lot of journalists, family-owned business, they want out. They find a buyer, a small publicly traded company from Toronto called Media Central Corporation. It owns Now, which is the Urban Weekly in Toronto, similar to the Georgia Strait. So the family, it seemed like a good fit. There might be some economies of scale, but they're both kind of in the same similar space. The family didn't charge a lot of money to sell their paper, $750,000 in cash, $350,000 worth of common shares. I'll get to that in a sec. And some assumption of debts. The common shares, though, on January 6th, when the deal was announced, we're selling at 4.8 cents. So that's a lot of shares. And there's an expectation, this exciting company is going to put together all these titles. The share price is going to go up and they're going to make a pile of money. Well, By August, the price dropped below a penny. It stayed below a penny, and then it reached a penny before the end of the year, but it never got above a penny. And then the deal closed on March 2nd. March 11th, the World Health Organization 2000 declares a global pandemic. A week later, I'm told by a guy from Toronto that the newsroom budget would be cut by around 50%. I can't remember, it was either 47% or 55%. It was massive. And a bunch of people were laid off. Similar story in production, circulation, sales, and even the general manager, who was the son of the founder, who had sold the paper, he was thrown over. So they were all sent layoffs from these people in Toronto, putting them on temporary layoffs. So it was a pandemic. It seemed that everything was coming to an end. Much of the business model of the Georgia Strait was actually, there's the editorial side, but the business model was predicated on people going out. You know, you go out to the arts events, you go to the movies, you go to the restaurants, and nobody was going out. As I look back, even though in the pandemic, the escort business dried up. Nobody wanted to be experts. And so this kind of delivered a bit of a body blow to the finances. So basically, traditionally, in arts and culture in recent years that have been paying the bills. Real estate was actually not very large at all. 2015, the demand exceeded the supply, and we didn't get these campaigns. And a lot of newspapers had that. So, but back to the pandemic, eventually the federal government offered a wage subsidy. Taxpayers cover 75% of a worker's pay. There were rent subsidies. And then things started looking a little brighter for us. We could bring laid off employees back. But the problem was for the freelancers, they weren't covered by the wage subsidy. So all of these people who've been writing freelance were kind of left out to dry. So, but the new owners were hit with various claims by employees who've been laid off and legal claims. So by the end of 2020, we had a core of older workers. You know, you tend to keep the older ones. Many have been there 15 years, some more than 25 years. Steve Newton had been there 38 years. Media Central's low share price caused a shareholder revolt. The shareholders were getting mad. Their stock was worth a penny. They thought they were going to get rich. A bunch of them got together, threw out the CEO, replaced his buddies on the board of directors. And then some of the lenders converted their debt into equity. And this is something that Mark goes into in his book as one of the tools. They thought, oh, the share price was going to go up. But some of the other debt holders didn't convert their debt into equity. And they ended up in the winners, as the winners in this corporate shell game. So I didn't want to be the last editor of the Georgia Strait. And I wasn't. Paper was eventually sold. There's someone else who's an editor now, so it didn't die on my watch. But I knew that if we wrote lots of articles for the website, this would bring in revenue. And this is something that people don't really realize. And Mark's book addresses this, and he will probably talk about it. Media companies can make a lot of money through websites. And so the way it works, here's the math and the back of the envelope. Just a second of math. My dad was a mathematician. So you could, if you have an article and you have one ad on that article and you get 1,000 page views on that article, you get $5 in advertising on programmatic advertising, which is basically computers buying ads from computers. So $5 for one. Well, if you have 4 of those ads on the page, on an online web page with an article, then you're up to $20 per 1,000 page views. Then if you get to 10,000 page views, there's $200. 100,000 page views, you get $2,000. So I'm worried about the future of you know, people, the remaining people's jobs. Carlito, one of my colleagues, we moved him and he liked writing about housing and real estate, and you just have to write anything about real estate in Vancouver and it will attract page views. So Carlito would do his articles, he would generate 200,000 to 300,000 page views every 10 days. And then Craig, another one of my colleagues, he liked covering COVID, and then he would do these crime and other news, and that would do 100,000 to 300,000 page views every 10 days. I would write political commentaries and other articles, and I might get 100,000 to 500,000 page views every 10 days. So as a result, I was estimating, and I didn't have access to all the information, I just was doing editorial, but I estimated the three of us, and there were a couple of other staff, were generating about $40,000 per month in programmatic ad revenue. And I felt this was helping us offset the loss and would keep us employed. But here's the catch. And I only found out about this near the end of my tenure. The parent company, Media Central Corporation, which had bought the Georgia Strait and now had diverted the programmatic advertising away from the paper in Vancouver, and they moved it to Toronto. So it ended up in the parent company's coffers and whatever they did. So I'm writing like a madman on the weekend. And unbeknownst to me, the money's going somewhere else and it's not even ending up in the paper. But we were selling prints and we did have the wage subsidy. So we were very happy. So another problem emerged, and this was connected to the lawsuits from the employees, who some of them didn't want to come back if they were laid off, or they were offered different terms. And they said, no, my contract says this. The parent company stopped paying the lawyers. So on May 31st, 2022, the Media Central, the parent company, files an assignment in bankruptcy. And the three directors resign, the company no longer has a president. It's a bankruptcy trustee who's in control, and that trustee answered to the debt holders. The debt holders who didn't convert their debt into equity. The two subsidiary companies, which is Vancouver Free Press, which owns the Georgia Strait, and now Central Communications, which owns the Now newspaper, they were not put into bankruptcy. And I'm still puzzled about this whole corporate situation. But the bankruptcy trustee put the parent company into bankruptcy, but not the other two. But the other two did not have directors, but they were still alive in the registrar of companies in their provincial jurisdictions. And the parent company entirely owned these subsidiary companies. So we continued publishing, and our ad people would sell our ads. So we continued publishing the papers, but then the debt holders could decide what to do with these assets. And then I received a call, I can't remember, but it was after the bankruptcy, maybe June or so. The president, now he's president of Georgia Strait, and now I'm living in Toronto. He says, Charlie, I have to go to BC Supreme Court tomorrow. How do you do a court case on Zoom? And I said, you can't go to BC Supreme Court on Zoom. What's the registrar's number? Here's the registrar's number. I can't get in. And I said, okay, I'll go in. I'll ask for an adjournment. And it was about a lawsuit by our former top salesperson. And this former top salesperson was one of the people who was laid off, didn't want to come back, and said the terms have been changed. Was seeking a judgment of almost $300,000. And the judge refused my request for an adjournment. The salesperson's lawyer was there too and had a perfectly prepared case seeking a summary judgment. And then he told me, the judge, that nobody had filed any evidence in the case in the company's defense. And I go, okay, all I can use is the evidence that the plaintiff had filed to muster arguments. And it was a production day. We had to send a paper to the printer that day. So I said, so the other lawyer's making the arguments. I said, Your Honor, can I please leave? and am I able to come back? And why would you want to do that? Don't you want to hear the arguments? I said, I'll get a paper printer. And so, anyway, he says, yeah, you could come back, you can speak tomorrow. So then I come in the next day, and I argued that, you know, the former salesperson's annual compensation was the highest in the company and was 3 times as high as the average newsroom employee. So, and salespeople get paid well because it's commission. I'm not criticizing this, I'm just saying that's the facts. I told the judge it'll be the end of the Georgia Strait. The rest of us will lose their jobs. Here are the people who are going to lose their jobs. And by the way, some of these people actually help the salesperson make a lot of money. I'm not disparaging the person. Everyone has the right to go to court. Judge ruled in favor of the former employee that reduced the award to $171,000. Company didn't pay her because it wanted to meet the payroll of 12 employees. And so the lawyer for the plaintiff garnished the bank account and left just like a few cents in the account. So we didn't get paid our paychecks that week. And then the president told us that the debt holder's representative was negotiating with a potential buyer. So that was pretty good news. We thought, okay, maybe we can keep the paper alive. So when it's sold, we'll still have our jobs. So some of us, including me, went 3 pay periods without pay, just keeping the thing going. And I'm a fortunate person, you know, I've worked in the media for years. I'm not crying about my own circumstances, but other people have much more hardship than me. And that turned out to be a mistake because when the paper was sold, it was called an asset sale. The new buyer bought the brand, bought the website, bought the archives, but not the employees. And so I was later told the deal closed on September 24th, 2022. On September 27th, the president of the company convened a Zoom call with all of us. And I had just come back from a vacation and we were all fired. And then he said he's resigned. And it's up to us to talk to the new owner and maybe they'll hire us back. And so now there was a newspaper company, Pancouver Free Press, with no employees and no assets. And eventually it was going to die because of failure to file with the registrar of companies the required financial information. So normally if you're fired without cause, you're eligible for severance and vacation pay. And there's also those 3 pay periods. But that wasn't, the new owner was saying we did not take on liability for severance and things like that. So I ended up starting a new media outlet called Pancouver with some friends, which is on a website. The debt holders, though, were paid through the asset sales of the Georgia Strait, and now the price was never revealed. One former staff member suggested to me that the Georgia Strait is $400,000. I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know how much the debt holders received for the sale of Now magazine. They went much longer without pay in Toronto. The company that bought the Georgia Strait told the Tyee reporter that termination of contracts was a standard practice with asset sales. So that's just the way it works. But some employees, former employees, have filed complaints with employment standards. There's been no ruling yet. Lots of us also filed a claim with the Federal Wage Earner Protection Program. And this was why I was working for Free Cash, because it offers a one-time payment of up to $8,278 for unpaid wages, vacation pay, termination pay, severance for employees. Doesn't cover 27 years of severance, but I thought, okay, that might offset, 3 pay periods for me. But here's the catch. The 2 subsidiaries, Vancouver Free Press and Now Central Communications, never went bankrupt. They just faded into oblivion. So the feds said we weren't eligible for this one-time payment for unpaid wages and unpaid severance, our claims were dismissed because our company never went bankrupt. The parent company went bankrupt. The subsidiaries faded into oblivion, but because we didn't meet the strict definition, I feel that violated the spirit of the program and the legislation upon which it was created in 2005, and even the comments of and there was a ministerial review, so I asked for a ministerial review, but it wasn't done by a minute. There was no ministerial review. It was another staff person in the department did the review. And then when he called me, he had, you know, when you get these calls and it says secret number or whatever it is, you can't tell who, you couldn't even tell who it was. And this person kept calling me from this, and I don't normally answer calls when I don't know who's calling me. And then finally I answered it, and it's this guy in Ontario with Service Canada who wants to discuss my appeal. And I said, how come you didn't put your, like, I didn't even know who you were. So anyway, so the debt holders let the company fade away. But then I got another rude surprise. I don't want to, like, I'm fine. I'm happy and everything else, but the Georgia Strait had libel insurance for many years. And always had libel insurance. I would talk with the publisher about the annual libel insurance policy. Well, when the Toronto people took it over, they said, we're going to consolidate libel insurance and it's going to be in Toronto. And we're going to do it for both papers. I stupidly thought, oh, I don't have to worry about that. Well, unbeknownst to me, the head office did not renew the libel insurance policy. And in 2022, I was sued for defamation in connection with an article about the anti-vaccine movement. Unfortunately, I believe I have a strong case. So I had to defend myself in court at my own expense. The downside is it cost me some money, but the lawyer's been very, I'll put in a plug for him, Alan McConkey, Roger McConkey's son. Roger and Alan worked together. He's given me a great deal. So I'm very happy about that. But the upside is now I know how to file a statement of defense, prepare a book of documents, a book of authorities for the court. And even though I lost my only case when I actually argued in court, I'm feeling pretty good about this case. But basically that's a case study which Marc's book writes about on a much larger scale. And he goes into other areas, and it's on a way bigger scale than any stock. So I'm going to pass the mic to Marc, but thank you very much for indulging me.
Thank you, Charlie, and Bob, and especially to Rolf for bringing up my university days at this very institution, although not at this very campus, which didn't exist back in the mid-1970s. This was up on Burnaby Mountain. When I started there, it was a hotbed of Marxism. It was teeming with Marxists. They were running around all over the place. I wanted to be a journalist, so I started working on the Peak, and it was always run by a cooperative. And it seemed nothing ever got done, at least not by deadline. So I decided one time I would run for editor, and not only would I make the trains run on time, I would make them run twice a week instead of once a week. And I got a bit of a bad reputation, I think. I think it was unfair, but I think it's safe to say that back then I did reject a lot of what the Marxists were saying. But and it's hard to believe that that was almost 50 years ago now. And in the intervening time, the more I've learned and the more I've kept my eyes, ears open, is I'm coming to see that, you know, the Marxists were right. They just, some of their methods weren't very efficient. And I just wanted to reciprocate for Rolf bringing that up by pointing out that our dirty little secret actually is that we both actually started in sports journalism before moving on to the real world. And it was this 1976 movie, All the President's Men, that made me want to cover more serious matters than sports. I started out in business, like Ralph mentioned. I got my degree in commerce, and I started out in business before moving into news. And unfortunately, the newspaper that I worked there for was a very serious newspaper at the time, called the Vancouver Province. But it started fading away for lack of advertising. So somebody in, I guess it was Don Mills, Ontario, got the bright idea of turning the province into a tabloid, which changed almost everything we did. And I was lucky in that I went down to the courthouse and covered the BC Supreme Court beat for the next 10 years before I couldn't take any more of the nonsense. And most of all, I saw this rather large tubby man coming down the road. His name was Conrad Black, and he was bound and determined to take over Southern newspapers, which Rolf and I used to work for. And he eventually accomplished that. And I've been writing about it ever since. But I think it is interesting in the broad sweep of my research that I actually started out as supposedly a very right-wing student journalist. I don't know if it was so much me or anybody else. But anyway, I wanted to respond also to a few of the things that Bob had to say about the importance of newspapers. I think a lot of people dismiss newspapers now because they see them as a dying breed. Well, I would like to point out that in the race to dominate online news, newspapers are actually starting in first place. And so if they succeed, they will end up dominating online news as well. And Bob asked the question of what I consider to be the most egregious offense. It's a rather long indictment facing Postmedia Network that I chronicle in my book. I think the most egregious aspect of what they've been doing is that they've been duping us, okay, along with most of the rest of the newspaper industry, duping us into thinking that they're dying and they need us to throw money at them. And now we need to make Google and Facebook start bailing them out. There are many other things that are egregious about their operations. Bob talked about the big oil partnership with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers in this so-called sponsored content or native advertising. Goes by several different names. The news and their editorial opinion is now basically for sale. Not just their opinion, but in many cases, the news. There was a case I talked about in the book about they entered into one of these partnerships with UBC, okay, to cover stories on campus in a certain way, and you could probably guess they're not going to cover them in a negative way. And I think this is the biggest crime that I see against Postmedia is that they've made news for sale. I don't really mind the partisanship so much. I think the National Post was actually a positive development in Canadian news media because it started to tell the conservative side, and there are a lot of conservatives out there. It's just that not too many of them are journalists. So anyway, Bob brings up the climate crisis, and of course this is now an existential crisis. And so if we're selling, editorial support for energy policies which don't take into account the survival of the planet, then I think we're in real big trouble. Bob makes a very good point about market-driven journalism. Can it fulfill its journalism duties? I'm increasingly of the opinion it can't. I think the biggest, and I mentioned this in starting chapter 2, the biggest problem with newspapers is that they were so profitable. They made so much money that the control of newspapers was taken away by money men, I call people like Conrad Black. And the control was taken away from the journalists, who of course they would spend loudly to get a story. Well, that was going to sit too well with the money men, and people like Conrad Black were very good at making money. Conrad Black was brilliant in that he got out of the very peak of the newspaper business at the millennium. He sold out to Izzy Asper and in this ill-fated experiment of convergence, which quickly crashed, and the Aspers were left holding the bag. Well, you have to wonder where Conrad Black's bags are stashed, somewhere in the Bahamas, I heard. And the ultimate question is, can private enterprise be a proper steward of journalism? And I think the one thing my book proves is that the answer to that is no. I think we're now in the end game of the for-profit media, simply because there's not that much money left. But the way that Postmedia Network is making money, it's not by journalism. They're not in the newspaper business. They're in the debt business. They're in the bond market. They're speculating on bonds. The way they make their money is not by dividends or from Postmedia earnings, or even by Postmedia's stock price. The way they make their money is they get paid first every month from the hundreds, millions of dollars in CanWest bonds, which they bought up when it was going bankrupt. And so desperate were the Aspers to try and stay afloat that they issued bonds at exorbitant interest rates, some as high as 12, 13%. Well, so assured was their demise through bankruptcy that these bonds started going for pennies on the dollar on the bond market. 5 to 10 cents on the dollar has been reported. Well, it's simple math. If you buy a bond that pays 12.5% interest annually, and you pay 10 cents on the dollar, then you've got an investment that pays 125%. All they had to do was keep the corpse of the dying newspaper chain alive, which I couldn't imagine they would have expected. It would have been more than 5 or 10 years that they would have been able to do this and keep this shell game going. Well, it's now been 13, and I think they should be happy to walk away with whatever else they can wring out of it. Anyway, and to follow on what Charlie had to say about his situation being kind of a case study, there are indeed eerie parallels with what's happening with the Canadian media, news media, and even alternative. So-called alternative media has been completely corporatized now by the money men. They use these fancy maneuvers, the Postmedia Network. You have to remember, it was an enterprise that was actually created out of bankruptcy. Okay, this is how they make their money, not from doing good journalism, but from collecting on the bonds that they hold. And he mentioned some of my research into public benefits. This was a paper that I wrote a few years ago. I studied mostly newspapers, but with convergence, I had to learn a little bit about broadcasting. And oh my God, the more I found out about the CRTC and the way it regulates, television, radio, and especially now telecommunications, the whole system is just rigged. I spent hours going through CRTC decisions just to unpeel this onion of public benefits. And what it was they decided that they were going to try and stop big media from getting bigger. They were going to charge big media for getting bigger. They put a price tag on it, 10% of the purchase price of any broadcasting licenses would have to go to what they call public benefits. And when you talk about acquisitions like the purchase of the CTV network by Bell Canada, which was $2.3 billion. Well, 10% of that is a whole lot of money, $230 million, and most of it went into Canadian content programming, but quite disturbingly, an increasing amount started going into schools of journalism, which then not only weren't quite as critical as they might have been, but actually started advocating for things like convergence, which don't get me going on that. Anyway, suffice it to say that yes, the system is rigged. There's this revolving door between the CRTC and a big telecom, mostly TELUS, Bell, Rogers. They call them three telecoms in a trench coat. That's Canada. So, but the problem is, like I say, I had to spend so much time digging into these CRTC decisions to figure out what was going on. The average person would never be able to, unearth this. And I made it, I wrote an academic paper, which was fairly technical, but to make them understandable for the average reader takes a lot of doing. Let's just say my tabloid reporting experience came in very handy, making things simple, or maybe a little bit sensational, or while trying not to oversimplify things. One point that Charlie made was that these hedge funds, mostly Chatham Asset Management now, or Chatham, New Jersey, although they took over in 2016 for Golden Tree Asset Management. I've compiled a table on page 203, which sets out the debt payments, which started off in 2011 as $80 million. And then as they gradually paid down some of the debt, it was in the 60s and $70 million. But then they almost went bankrupt. In 2016, Paul Godfrey had to pull a fancy maneuver and refinancing, where the hedge funds forgave about half of the debt that they held. So the company became a little bit more sustainable. After 6 years, well, it's been another 6 years, and now they're underwater again. But the quid pro quo for giving half of the debt that they held was that they got even more shares of ownership. They already had 92% of the shares, and they got finally, I think it was 98% ownership of Postmedia Network. And keep in mind that there's supposed to be a 25% limit on foreign ownership of Canadian newspapers and other sensitive industries like uranium mining for some reason. Well, they got around this with another fancy maneuver. They started up a publicly traded company in which the foreign owners, their shares would be variable voting shares to keep their so-called control under 25%. But if you believe that they don't control the company and own 98% of the shares, I've got a bridge on that to sell you. So the whole thing is a farce, and luckily it's crashing and burning. That's the best news from my research. It can't possibly last much longer unless Ottawa bails it out yet again, and hopefully they won't do that at my urging. But Charlie also mentioned the totality of the debt payments. If you look on that table, 203, page 203, I calculated it's about $600 million that they've taken out of Canada's largest newspaper chain over the past dozen years. Think of the kind of journalism that could have been produced with $600 million. Anyway, it is a very complex business that we're talking about here, and it's taken a lot of research to get to the bottom of things. I didn't even understand some of the things I was writing about, for example, collateral debt obligations or credit default swaps, that's it. I quoted some people on what it meant, but I still haven't been able to wrap my head around that one. And the very concept of a hedge fund, I heard the term for years, but never really knew what it was until I did the research. Going back into the 60s, there became a new type of a mutual fund, which evaded all regulation by operating not as a mutual fund, but as a limited partnership of investors. And so they could invest in all sorts of exotic financial instruments like credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations. And they have, there are almost no rules that they are subject to. So my problem has been trying to make, well, first of all, to wrap my own head around it. And second of all, to make it understandable for the average reader who might not have a degree in business, or two of them, or three of them, like I have. But anyway, it's very complex. I think that my main takeaway is that we have been bamboozled. We've been duped because these are very sharp investors. Okay. And the worst thing is that they tried to convince us, you know, that they're doing their very best to produce the best journalism they possibly can. Well, that's just nonsense. Anyway, I would like to point out that this book is the third in a trilogy, which started in 2001 when I twisted Rolf's arm into publishing my doctoral thesis, full-length hardcover. That was the history of Pacific Press, the partnership between the Vancouver Sun and Province, dating to 1957, which was the subject of a federal inquiry by the competition regulator of the day, was found to be an illegal monopoly, but it was allowed to stand because they claimed that under the prevailing natural monopoly theory of newspapers, as it then was, that if they weren't allowed to go into business together, soon there would only be one newspaper in Vancouver. And that was a very interesting story, but it was an academic history. And as an academic history, it had to end sufficiently far in the past to qualify. And 10 years is kind of the bare minimum. So I ended the story in 1991 with the Sun moving to morning publication, direct competition with the Province, which had always been a morning paper, or at least under Pacific Press. And there had been so much happen in the intervening 10 years, I figured I could probably have written another book. Ken West had just bought the newspapers from Conrad Black, and a few years later, Rolf prevailed upon me, as the convergence model was crashing and burning, to write the second in the trilogy, the sequel, Asper Nation, subtitled Canada's Most Dangerous Media Company. And like I say, I had to branch out from writing about the newspaper industry to the broadcasting industry, which is a lot more complex. So you really need to understand what's going on now with the Postmedia network controlling the newspapers. You have to understand, going back, especially in this city, going back to 1957, it was an illegal monopoly. It was allowed to stand, and things have been going from bad to worse ever since. I think bad to worse to now execrable, totally unacceptable. So anyway, they say that good things come in threes. That's what I'd like to think about this trilogy of books. But I think it's also true that bad things come in threes. And even since this book has come out in April, we have had, it seems, the whole Canadian news media crashing around us. Bill C-18 was passed last month. Like I say, this is a second bailout, really, is what it is. The newspaper industry prevailed upon Ottawa to bail them out to the tune of $595 million over 5 years, starting in 2019. That ends in the spring. The argument was made by Postmedia CEO Paul Godfrey at the time, was that just give us 5 years, okay? If we can't make it to the digital transition by then, you know, we probably don't deserve to continue on. Well, now, of course, they're saying, well, Google and Facebook, they're not fighting fair. Okay, they're taking all the ad money. I don't think they can really think far enough ahead. They're playing checkers while the tech giants are playing three-dimensional chess. These are not Canadian companies that they're trying to squeeze money out of. These are foreign enterprises that, more importantly, operate in cyberspace. Okay, they don't have to be subject to Canadian regulations. They can just pick up their marbles and go home. And it looks like that's what's going to happen, which, like I say, will basically leave Postmedia Network without visible means of support. My research found that they went underwater in their last fiscal year, ending August 31st, 2022, when they recorded profits of only $13 million, almost 10 million of which came from federal subsidies or provincial subsidies. And like I say, they're on the hook for $30 million a year in debt payments to their hedge fund overlords. Apparently they've stopped paying, well, because they can't. And I think that everybody's just waiting to see what will happen with Bill C-18 and whether Google and Facebook will pay up. It doesn't look like they're going to. So we're going to be in a very serious situation indeed. And then Postmedia announced one fine day after there had been some very curious trading on the stock market in its shares, that yes, they were indeed in merger talks with Northstar Capital, which owns the Toronto Star, the largest and most liberal daily in Canada. Basically, those talks have broken off, but I think there's still a possibility. And then, of course, we had Bell Canada, the largest media company in the country, with annual profits of about $10 billion, greater than the GDP of many countries, announcing that well, they closed 6 radio stations across the country, including 2 here in Vancouver, including my presets 1 and 2, by the way. They closed the CTV Vancouver Island News Bureau, and it's going to be now produced out of Vancouver. And they want Ottawa, the CRTC, to allow it to cut back on its news obligations, also its Canadian content obligations. So I believe that we're at a critical juncture now, and that it's time for a radical rethink of Canadian news media. Postmedia Network, at least, is at a tipping point, and it is going down. So I think we need to prepare for a future in which money is not the be all and end all of news media. So I think all the signs point to a non-profit model. But I think it's also important that we rescue some of the historic dailies, whether they will remain in print form. The fact remains that they've been with us for a long time. They're important community and cultural institutions. The Vancouver province was founded in 1898. The Vancouver Sun in 1913. Well, the Montreal Gazette goes all the way back to 1798. So I think the government in Ottawa should be thinking, if they haven't already, been about trying to rescue some of these important institutions from the clutches of the hedge.
Thank you, Mark. We're starting to run a bit short on time.
We do have some questions, comments, I think, from the interviews. And how do you want to handle this, Melissa? Do you want to come up and read them out or? Okay. Okay, does anybody in the room, in our live audience, tonight have any comments or questions that they would like to ask Mark or any of them? Hearing none. Wow, that was good.
You mentioned that alternative media are also being advertised.
Yes, well, I wasn't really, I've heard about what happened with the Georgia Strait, but in listening to the, you know, the litany of what Charlie had to tell us about, that's just shocking to me. And I guess that, you know, these money men, as I call them, they can spell a dollar from a mile away. And I think it's shocking that even our alternative media is subject to this type of fiscal manipulation.
Yeah, this also happened south of the border before it had happened in Canada. New Times Media, then it eventually became Village Voice Media, and they were buying up all of these different alternative publications in the States. So it has been going on. The alternative media has had a tough time. These urban weeklies, they call them. But at the same time, some of them are carrying on. So I think if you listen to Bloomberg Radio, did you, Mark?
I did, but it was actually my precept too from what it was.
Oh, okay.
In that case, maybe we can wrap it up and then have a few, there's actually quite a bit of cheese sauce that we already tested. So let's, why don't we wrap?
What's the future of nonprofits, co-op radio and newspapers, do you think?
No, I'm not too familiar with co-op radio. I knew.
Cooperative, nonprofit.
Yes. Well, I think that is the way of the future. Okay, we do have co-ops like Chefka TV in Victoria was taken over by a cooperative of its employees when Can West was going bankrupt. I'm actually starting to think now it gets a bit boring just talking about all the problems. I'm starting to think now about some of the solutions, and I think nonprofit is definitely the way to go. There will have to be some assistance from the federal government, as communication is a federal responsibility. But I'm also wondering what can the provinces do? I think Quebec has been a bit more proactive than the rest of the provinces, but something sure got to be done, and it would be nice for everybody to get on the same page.
Can I say, I'm glad to hear you say that. I think you're a good fit for Canadian dimension now. So I was worried you were going to call for more competition, but
Well, I think we need competition. Okay, here's what I would like to see. I would like to see the CBC bolstered. Okay, and because in many communities, that's all they've got is the CBC. I had the misfortune to be stuck in a couple of coastal harbors in this province for a couple of months at a time, Prince Rupert and Port Hardy, and the CBC was about the only game in town as far as radio went. But I'd also like to see a system where the Canadian press is also bolstered. It's an historic institution in this country. It was a cooperative of newspaper publishers, and it was started up to share the news, but then it grew and started establishing its own bureaus across the country and across the world. And so I think if we had a strengthened CBC and a strengthened CP, then we would have competition, and you wouldn't have just one source of news, you would have more than one sense of news. And that's why I still think we need competition.
I'll just add one thing, if you don't mind, is the conversation, which is actually public, and you mentioned it, Mark, they publish commentaries by academics, but it's very reader friendly. It's not too much academese. And what I like about the conversation, they have different versions. They've got UK, they've got, I think, New Zealand, US, Canada. These articles, they also make available to any media in the country for free. So you can reproduce them. And I really like that model. And I go there just to read it as a site, because I find the articles quite interesting and informative, and on a broad range of topics and quite timely. And I think we need to have more of that too, and maybe incentives for that.
We're going to go to
Great, good to hear.
Did Check TV do something?
Yes.
Employee owned. And was it your book, Mark, or did I see it somewhere else? Somebody mentioned the Saskatchewan Roughmire model of community ownership.
Yes, that was a report by the Public Policy Forum, and I actually agree with them. I think community, if not ownership, at least involvement. There are several different models that have been floated by different theorists. For example, the French economist Yulia Cagé, the wife of Thomas Piketty. She's got a model that's kind of halfway between a foundation and a stock trading company, although the shares would not trade publicly. They would be owned by members of the community, the journalists that work at the publications, members of the reading public. And it would be able to accept tax deductible donations. People could donate money and write it off on their income tax. So I think, and the government has made some moves in this regard with the 2019 bailout. They allowed newspapers to declare nonprofit status. Very few have. La Presse in Montreal has, the Narwhal in Victoria, and a few others, but not too many. So I think we need more of these non-profit type enterprises. So I'm glad to hear that Prince Albert is making a goal, but I was too familiar with that. Thank you.
Well, Charlie mentioned the conversation, very little, a little bit about the university.
Yeah. Yeah, the university's finance and the academics rate for it. Yeah.
They're the ones that.
I also find that even the retired academics who write Substack is quite informative. Like Charles Menzies, he's not retired yet, but at UBC, Wesley Warwick on national security. You know, I'm reading these things and subscribing to them and finding them quite informative. And it may not be for everyone, and it's not a solution for the massive void that's been created by the hedge funds, but for individuals, it's an option. If you want to get informed and you don't think the media is giving you the goods.
Well, let's face it, the internet's great. You can find so much information out there. It's been said that we're now in a golden age of journalism because we have so much information at our fingertips from around the world. But the problem is that while the internet is a global medium, it's not really a local medium. And local news is what is suffering. And that's what needs to be remediated. And I think Ottawa's going to have to do a much better job and maybe start listening to others other than just the newspaper lobby who are extremely self-interested. I think, you know, if they'd kept their eyes and ears open a little bit better, they could have done a better job than they certainly have in the past 5 years with all these bailouts. I think we need a national strategy rather than the patchwork quilt that we've been seeing of bailouts and subsidies, and now the harebrained scheme that is Bill C-18. We've come to a point now where we need, like I say, a radical rethink of the whole media system.
So it's exciting times.
Certainly are.
And one of the rethinks could involve a simple 3-word phrase, let them fail. because it's a funny country, you don't have to be too big to fail at all. You don't have to be too big at all to be too big to fail.